my channel. My name is Meenakshi and I'm doing a video series on the Indian Contract Act 1872. In today's video, we will be discussing Section 1 of the Indian Contract Act. Section 1 of the Indian Contract Act tells us three main things. First of all, like any other regular acts, it tells us about the name of this legislation. So the complete name of this legislation is the Indian Contract Act 1872. Secondly, it tells us about the applicability of this act. So if you read the provision under the bare act, you would see it is mentioned that this provision or this legislation is applicable throughout India, but except the state of Jammu and Kashmir. But now, after Article 370 has been repealed, a question that comes to our mind is whether Indian Contract Act is applicable to the Union Territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh or not. So if ever while reading any legislation, you come across this question whether this legislation is applicable to Jammu and Kashmir or not, there is one legislation that you should refer to. It is the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act of 2019. So this legislation is having different schedules. If you go through the fifth schedule, it provides a detailed list of legislations that will now be applicable to Jammu and Kashmir and also Ladakh. So what you can do is whatever legislation you are reading or regarding whatever legislation you have the question, you can just look for name of that legislation in that particular schedule. Take for example, now we are reading about the Indian Contract Act. So what we will look for? In fifth schedule of the Reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir Act, we would look for the Indian Contract Act. So in that list, in serial number 42, you will see Indian Contract Act is mentioned. And it also mentions that this part that mentioned except the state of Jammu and Kashmir, now this part shall be omitted. That means from now on, this particular legislation, the Indian Contract Act 1872, will be applicable to the Union Territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh as well. So even if now also if you are going through the legislation of Indian Contract Act, the bare act of Indian Contract Act, you would come across that it's not applicable to Jammu and Kashmir, but you should read this legislation along with this Reorganization Act. So what we know, this particular legislation, the Indian Contract Act 1872 is applicable to the whole of India, including Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. The third thing that Section 1 of Indian Contract Act tells us is with regard to applicability of any statute, act or regulations which are not been expressly repealed by this act. So if there are some usages, customs which were applicable even before Indian Contract Act came into picture, those will still be applicable if Indian contract is expressly not repealing those provisions or those legislations or those parts. So these are the three main things that Indian Contract Act Section 1 tells us about. Firstly, name of the Indian Contract Act, that is the Indian Contract Act 1872. Secondly, with regard to scope or application of this legislation. So it is applicable throughout India, including the Union Territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. Thirdly, it tells us that if there are any usages, practices, acts, legislations, if there were any provisions that were applicable, those will continue to apply in case Indian Contract Act is not expressly repealing those provisions. So that was all about Section 1 of the Indian Contract Act. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.